Hello and welcome to Macros with Mythili, our weekly program that takes a hard look at all the major macroeconomic issues and developments in India and overseas. This week we're going to focus on the just completed spectrum auction. After 19 days of bidding, the government has raked in rupees 1.1 lakh crore. That's almost a fifth of the country's fiscal deficit for FY16. Of course, the entire sum will not come in one shot. Indeed, nothing may come at all this fiscal, since telecom companies have 10 days to pay up even the first installment. But that apart, the broader question remains. How should one look at the auction? As a wild success or as a Pyrrhic victory that will extract a huge toll on the country? To discuss the issue threadbare, we have with us three eminent experts. Sanjeev Aga, former head of Idea Cellular, Rekha Jain, head of the Telecom Policy Centre, Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and Dr. S. Narayan, former Finance Secretary, Government of India. Welcome to the show. Rekha, if I may start with you. You know, after all the controversies that Telecom has gone through, one would have thought, and everybody's agreed, that auction really is the way to go. But now that the government has completed such a successful auction, why is it that there seems to be so much criticism? Is it that we can never be satisfied, damned if you do and damned if you don't? Or is it just that we're being argumentative Indians? What really is the issue?
So thanks, Mythili, for having me on this panel. The way I looked at it is that the issue was of high auction prices is what has been the bone of contention. There are two ways to look at it. It's not just that the high spectrum prices contribute to the problems of operators. It is also the operational aspects of making spectrum available in time, making the equipment available in time, being able to roll it out, set the towers, etc., which contribute to the cost of service provision. So we should have a look at that. Oftentimes, bidders have bid for spectrum but haven't got it because the government couldn't get it cleared for them. The second aspect is, could government have actually made more spectrum available, which would have led to possibly lower prices for spectrum, and yet led to better outcomes for all the citizens and hence the government.
Sanjeev, would you agree with Rekha? Auctions are indeed the right way to do price discovery. Then why is industry unhappy about the price that's been discovered consequent on the auctions?
Mythili, give me a minute. It is not my contention that the prices are high, nor is it my contention that auctions are not the best way. But I need just half a minute or a minute to develop my argument. Now, the first thing is that telecom, along with rail and road, are the three networks whose capacity to drive the economy and transform the economy is unparalleled. Now, if you look at the golden years of the Indian economy in terms of GDP growth alone, period from 2003 to 2008, when we were almost averaging 9% GDP real growth, it is not coincidental that those were also the years when we had the fastest rollout of telecom networks. In fact, there is an IIMA study which says that 10% increase in India of teledensity contributed 1.2% extra to GDP growth. Now, this is the first point I want you to register. The second point I want you to register is that spectrum is a constantly extinguishing resource. It's a perishing resource. It's like sunshine in a solar plant. If you block it, it is lost forever. Now, India, compared to every other country, utilizes 40% less spectrum in the core bands compared to any other country in the world. And even of the 60% that is deployed, it is immobilized because there is fragmentation, there are restrictions like liberalization and no ICR. So effectively you are deploying half your spectrum which you could. Now, there are many studies, and I don't want to bore your viewers by referencing them, but there are many studies which will establish that the cost of not deploying the spectrum to the Indian economy is at least 3 lakh crores to the size of the economy per year in terms of unrealized economic benefit. Now, this is 3 lakh crores per year. Against this, you are talking of a 1.1 lakh crore for 20 years collection by way of auction money. My argument is that if you had put all the spectrum out with spectacular results for the society and the economy, you would get similar collections. But the approach of choking spectrum and extracting is not just myopic, which is a commonly used word, it is parasitic. And the government does not understand it, and that is the second part of my argument, that there is no other country in the world where decisions of specialist sectors are taken by people who don't understand the sector.
Sanjeev, we'll ask Dr. Narayan that as a person who's not a specialist and a generalist, what was his view in the finance ministry, number one? Number two, you talked about how the telecom sector is a driving force for economic growth. But when the government raises revenue through this, you can call it revenue or, well, not quite revenue, but raises funds, and it uses it to spend for the benefit of the country as a whole, then the economy itself expands much more dramatically. So between telecom being a driving force and government being the driving force, which takes precedence, Dr. Narayan?
Totally agree with you, Mythili, because we have to look at it not just as the money earned from spectrum. Spectrum is a source of revenue for the government. And why is it a source of revenue? Because in the last 10 years we have made the penetration so good, and we have made services available on the phone through the digital media, including rail connectivity, etc., so good that it has become a very useful tool for economic development, and so people should pay for it. Just as for the roads we had the concept of tolls some time back, now here is a concept where they have to pay for the improved services. We are not, the 25 years ago the spectrum was given just for voice. Now it is being used for far more useful purposes. And I would like to develop one small argument here, that how government can utilize this money better. You are aware of the big Swachh Bharat program that PM has launched. Now it's very clear that management of waste is becoming, I would say, a subsidy program, because it's not able to pay for itself, and waste is created by the individual. So why not I argue that here's spectrum which is being used by the individual, which will be used to subsidize a very big Swachh Bharat program. So I would like to argue that there are many ways of using this revenue.
Rekha, would you agree with Dr. Narayan that if you have to choose between sanitation, primary healthcare, primary education, that should take precedence over anything remotely comparable to making telecom access, cheaper, more affordable, more widespread? Would you agree with him on that?
See, I don't totally agree with him. Ultimately, it is the government's policy decision as to how they spend the money from the Consolidated Fund of India. But in all countries, if you recognize that telecom is the driver of GDP growth, it is also the driver of competitiveness, global competitiveness today. So should we not spend at least a significant part of it back into servicing the sector itself, in terms of, see, why don't we have a plan of making smartphones available at 200 to 500 rupees today? So when we say their auction prices were high and therefore consumers will be hit, I think they will not be hit. The barrier today is not the per unit price. The barrier today is the device. So today, if everybody had smartphones, just imagine how quickly we could deliver education, e-government service. In fact, health delivery, etc., all these could be more efficiently managed. I don't say that just because you have to spend all this money on spectrum or the telecom sector alone, but you must spend a large part of it, because it is the users of that sector who are paying this tax.
Absolutely. It is the users of the sector who are paying the tax, but we'll come to that issue a little later. Right now, we have to slip into a very short break, but please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we're discussing the just completed spectrum auction. How good is it? How bad is it? And what are the consequences for the sector and for the economy as a whole? Sanjeev, before the break, you were talking about how spectrum is a perishable resource. Now, is it quite the same as coal? Can you compare it and call it a perishable resource in that sense? And as Dr. Narayan says, why can't the users of telecom services pay for it? Because after all, the users of the telecom services are a smaller subset than the population as a whole. So the people who will benefit from, cheaper education, primary healthcare, they are much more deserving than telecom users, surely.
Mythili, you're making it a zero-sum game, which it is not. First of all, if you don't mine coal, it remains there. But if you squander spectrum, it is gone permanently. It is not perishable, it is perishing even as I and you speak. So that's the first point. As I mentioned, the unrealized economic benefit every year that we are squandering because we don't realize this central fact is 3 lakh crores. It's almost 2 to 3% of the GDP. Anyway, let me forget that. Your second question is that I am not at all in favor of subsidy for the telecom sector. We just want that, these artificial man-made barriers, and I should not use the word we because I am not a participant of the sector, these man-made policy barriers which are holding the country back for no rhyme or reason and doing no one any good. It does not do anyone any good if spectrum is not deployed. It is not helping education, it is not helping health. It will just help the country if the economy grows faster, everything will grow faster. Financial inclusion follows if there is added broadband and telecom penetration. But I also went to you because you used the term this has been a successful auction. Let me just point out 2 or 3 very basic facts. The first thing is, and this is important because yours is a channel which is going into some depth. Every time there is a change of policy, there was NTP 99. On 1st August 99, all the old licenses and policies were brought into a sunset period and you had a new regime. Similarly, when we had the Unified Access Services license on 23rd November 2003, everything was sort of merged and you had a new policy. Now this time you have a funny situation that you will eventually have in one circle 8 operators operating under 8 different regimes. You haven't seen the beginning of the madness and no one seems to have talked about it. Now let me tell you another thing. You've got auction of in-use spectrum. Now no one is saying don't auction spectrum, but if you are going to determine the price where one competitor is going to lose his business, you are going to have distortions. And finally, in this auction alone in the world, you have a situation that one person is bidding for 0.6 megahertz, another person is bidding for 5 megahertz. And like if you have played, I'm sure you haven't played Flush, which is the 3-card game, it is like one person playing a 1 rupee blind, the other person has to counter with 10 rupees. And you will see the examples, you have collected 1 lakh crore, but see the composition of the winning, see the spectrum which is left unsold, see the relative prices. So there are these fundamental questions, which no country has. There is no country in the world which runs policies with such elementary errors. And that's why I cannot just look at 1 lakh crores and feel very chuffed about it.
Absolutely. Nobody denies there have been some huge errors, particularly in auction design. But Dr. Narayan, Sanjeev talked about, he said that you haven't seen the beginning of the madnesses yet. But is this a result of government, focusing entirely only on the revenue and trying to maximize revenue? Or is this a consequence of not having specialists and relying on generalists in government who only look at the bottom line, the fiscal deficit?
I think first is that you cannot, yes, it is important to look at this telecom auction from a sectoral point of view, the benefits and disadvantages to the sector. But at the government level, one has to look at a much larger point of view. And the larger point of view is that in today's sector, the economy changes every 10 years, the decadal structure of the economy actually changes. We would not be having this discussion, let us say 10 years ago, because this kind of money, this kind of telecom penetration did not exist. So government is quite right, quite at liberty to take advantage of the fact that here is a resource which people should pay for. And therefore, what people should pay for is the rate at which people are willing to subscribe for these services. And therefore, I see nothing wrong in government adopting a method of finding the price in an open market in a transparent manner. And if what I am concerned, and I go back to my earlier point, is the use of this money. If this use of this money is merely for revenue deficit, for payment of salaries, I would seriously worry. If it goes for furthering any kind of a government's program, whether social, whether developmental, then I would say it's money very, very well used, because the multiplier effect, both from the use of this spectrum, both the use of this digital media, as well as from that use of the government money, would be quite significant. And I see an opportunity for the government here of taking a double advantage. If you look at the budget numbers this year, you will find a substantial amount of capital expenditure coming out of resources which I would say are gained out of a little bit of normal tax revenue methods, disinvestment auction sale, etc., which I think is good, because you're selling a resource and investing in another resource, which is what we would normally do even in a normal budgeting scenario. So I don't see anything wrong in the method and the approach that the government is following.
But Dr. Narayan, given the government's track record in spending money, it's been hardly efficient at, you can hardly call it efficient. So in the process, in this focus on maximizing revenue, and because, partly through flawed design, restricting the amount of spectrum that is available, etc., are we guilty of killing the goose that lays the golden egg?
No, I don't think so. I mean, this argument, I mean, if you just have to look at the budget numbers this year, the budget numbers talk about, let us say, extra infrastructure investment of 70,000-80,000 crores, and you look back at the revenue numbers and you say 50,000-60,000 crores is coming out of disinvestment receipts, as I said, coal auction, etc., etc. So you are, I mean, this is what I mean, you would do as even in a household. If there is a fixed deposit and you want to buy a house, you'd sell the fixed deposit and put the money into the house. It's replacing one kind of asset by another, and that asset which you are replacing it by, hopefully, is going to give you much more, I would say, public satisfaction, much more growth. And therefore, I mean, government is very legitimate. In fact, I'm very happy that this balance is coming up with the budget.
Oh, absolutely. But I'm afraid on that note, we have to slip into another very short break. But please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we're discussing the telecom auctions, what's good and what's not so good about the auction. Rekha, if I can come back to you, I think both you and Sanjeev, and I think even Dr. Narayan agreed that auction is the right way to go. But clearly there were some design flaws in the auction which haven't given you as much bang for the buck as far as the sectoral outcome is concerned. So what are the changes in the auction design that you could suggest to ensure that not just the sector, the economy, it's win-win for everyone?
So a number of things, Mythili. One has to do with auction design, but I think if we only look at auction design, then we are looking at a limited picture. So first let me come to auction design. So this time the good thing about the auction was that it made multiple bands available simultaneously. That means companies could bid for any one of the 4 bands that were available for auction. And could make trade-offs at different points in time. So that was the good point, So it lets the economy know which bands were valued by whom and the price they were willing to pay. The part that I think could have been designed better was the units in which this spectrum was bundled for auction. For some of the bands, the spectrum was auctioned in very small bands, and therefore there could be a kind of, while auction is fine, but the rules should be such that they don't allow kind of devious behavior by some of the bidders. And so what one could do was to bid very high on a small bundle and walk out at that point in time without having increased the overall bid price, without having to pay for the entire bundle which some other company was really interested in. So I think that was the auction design element that could have been examined better, could have been designed better. So that was one part. And I was saying there were larger issues, which is, we've been talking of incentive auctions, we've been talking of how do we refarm our spectrum, and could we have used auctions for refarming the spectrum that is not available with us? Could we have formed the institutional mechanism which will ensure that future spectrum auctions do not have some of the design flaws that we had? So that was the one part. And if we look at prices, in fact, I've been doing some calculations on the per megahertz per population price, and barring the metros, the prices are not that high, considering that this is for a 20-year period.
Sanjeev, Rekha says the prices are not so high. Maybe you'll agree with her on that. But apart from the flaws that she pointed out, what are the other policy flaws that you would like the government to correct if they were to redo this exercise? Maybe if you could go back in time and redesign the whole thing, what are the kind of changes that you would have liked to see?
The obvious change I've already mentioned, Mythili. I cannot imagine any competitive market where you have 6 different concurrent policy regimes. So obviously you have to have a sunset date, and you have to bring everyone on the same page. I'm a little surprised that even the TRAI hasn't taken this up, because otherwise the TRAI's recommendations on telecom were harsh, but they were perfect. They were logical. and it is absurd that the government has just put them in the trash bin. So that's number one. Number two, I would get back, I've been looking at this sector for years, and I always think if we solve this problem, the problem will go away if we solve this. But observing it from the time of Pandit Sukhram, I've come to think of it in certain root causes. And there is no country in the world, no country, I'm not saying 90%, 80%, no country in the world which has not deployed all its spectrum resources, either 90%, 85%, 95%. We are at 50%. I'm not saying that, you should not be unique, but you have to examine that what is wrong with us. Is there something we are missing? That's number one. Secondly, there is no country. Just this morning before coming to your show, I went into Google. Every country in the world telecom policy, just like the central bank does the monetary policy, there is a specialist telecom regulator made up of administrators, economists, sector experts who do telecom regulation. It's a complex subject, and you have people who don't even understand that they are making a mistake. So how will they ever correct a mistake? I fear that we will go from one mistake to another mistake until we improve a fundamental method of governance.
Rekha, would you agree? What are the other policy flaws that you would like the government to correct if they were to redo this exercise? Maybe if you could go back in time and redesign the whole thing, what are the kind of changes that you would have liked to see?
See, as I said, we need to make more spectrum bands available. It may not lead to revenue maximization as the government says, but what is going to happen is that you are releasing the potential for large sectors of the economy to pick up. For example, our 700 megahertz band is not up for auction, and we do not know when it will become up for auction. So while government has been giving deadlines, these haven't been met. In many countries, 700 megahertz has been made available and companies are providing services there. So why is it that our country, having the same amount of spectrum as every other country, yet our companies are denied access to that kind of natural resource? This is what I say, when you say it's a perishable resource but doesn't deplete with time, but you must get value for it per unit time, otherwise you've lost that resource, the economic value of that resource. So I think therefore I would have suggested more spectrum bands, larger bundles on which to, or larger units of spectrum on which companies could bid, and ensuring that other services supporting ecosystem is available to companies to roll out, like SACFA clearances take forever. Spectrum doesn't get allocated. So can companies kind of make the government responsible or accountable for those kind of delays in spectrum? But otherwise I think it was a good spectrum design.
Dr. Narayan, in India we don't take our regulators seriously. Is that partly to do with the entire governance system in India itself? And also, how can we improve the system whereby should we make regulators recommendations, not just recommendations, but mandatory, or should government always reserve the last right to have the last word?
I think the Reserve Bank governor has been making several comments about this, and I totally agree with him that sometimes we over-regulate and sometimes we create regulators without specifying the turf on which they are supposed to regulate. I mean, I can look at some of the regulators who are constantly at battle with the ministries because ministries don't want to let go turf to the regulators. And we have other regulators where the regulators' views are not being taken seriously by the ministries. So I do think that the entire regulatory framework needs a very serious relook. Do we need so many regulators? And do we need so many regulators to be, I would say, staffed by, I would say, a lot of my ex-colleagues? Isn't there a better way of doing it? And I totally share this concern that we are probably creating a parallel bureaucracy there, I mean, in the regulators, not just in this sector, but in a number of sectors.
Sanjeev, I'm going to let you have the last word. As somebody who has extensive experience of the sector at the grassroots level, what are the two main recommendations that you would make going forward?
I'd written a piece. If I was the Prime Minister, chances of which are very remote, but the easiest reform, the lowest hanging fruit for the Indian economy is to get the ministry and the department, because department, believe me, is full of people who have no experience. They are neither economists, nor administrators, nor trained in policy, nor worked in telecom. They are there by an accident. and neither do they read, I'm sorry to say, because for various reasons. And just get them out of the way, get the ministry out of the way, you can retain the absolute sovereign right. But let the regulator, and not the regulator which is patchy, as we have seen over the last 15 years, but get good quality people, independent people, impartial people, by all means some senior IAS people, because they have a lot of experience, but not only the IAS people. And just like we can trust our monetary policy with the RBI, why can't you trust the telecom policy? You will do a far damn sight better job, is my single point submission.
Okay, thank you so much. Dr. Narayan, I'm sure has something to answer in response to that, but I'm afraid we're completely out of time. So thank you so much, Sanjeev, Rekha, as well as Dr. Narayan, for joining us. Clearly, as far as the telecom sector is concerned, it's a long learning curve and we're just at the beginning of it all. Thank you also so much for watching. We'll be back next week with yet another edition of Macros with Mythili. Till then, it's thank you and goodbye from all of us at ET Now.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/etnow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at etnowlive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/etnow.